مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لم يسبق في تاريخ أمتنا أن شكلت قضية أمن الانتخابات أولية عليا كما هي بالنسبة لانتخابات 2020 الرئاسية. هذه أول انتخابات تلي الهجوم المباشر الذي وقع عام 2016 حين بدأ واضحا أن قوى أجنبية ومن بينها روسيا وإيران سعت جاهدة للتدخل في نظامنا السياسي الداخلي. بسبب فيروس كورونا تشكل صحة الناخبين وعاملين بمراكز الاقتراع أحد الشواغل المهمة للمرة الأولى في تاريخ الحديث. وبسبب الفيروس سيكون عدد الناخبين الذين سيدلون بأصواتهم عن طريق بطاقات الاقتراع البريدية أكبر من أي انتخابات سابقة في التاريخ الأمريكي. أضاف هذه المكونات إلى أسوأ اقتصاد منذ الكساد الكبير والتطورات الأمريكية المشتعلة التي تطال أجزاء كبيرة من بلدنا والتحيز الحزبي المخموم والمرير الذي تشهده السياسة الأمريكية اليوم، ولن يكون هناك سبب للقلق بشأن أمن انتخابات نوفمبر. ولكن لحسن الحظ يوجد بعض الأشخاص الأذكياء جدا الذين يفكرون في هذه المشاكل. وهذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن ضيفنا هو واحد من أذكائهم، وهو مؤسس ومدير مركز الابتكار الانتخابي والأبحاث ديفيد بيكر. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. In this unusual year, we are about to have an unusual election. An election under the shadow of foreign interference from our last election, and an election under the shadow of COVID-19. What does all this mean for voting, for election security, for the integrity of our democratic system? To discuss these issues, I am delighted to welcome one of America's foremost experts on elections, David Becker. David, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
So before we get into the particulars of this election, let's just remind our viewers about how our system works here in the United States. Who makes the rules about elections? Who counts the votes? Who supervises the ballots?
So America is different than almost any other country in how it runs elections, and it's different in a couple of ways. First, our ballots are actually surprisingly long for a lot of people who aren't familiar or vote in other democracies. Our ballots can be as long as 12 or 15 pages because you're voting on so many races and initiatives rather than what happens in a lot of countries where you might just have one race to vote on. But who's responsible for those ballots and how elections are run is another big way in which we're different. We don't have one big election coming up in November. We actually have about 10,000 little elections because the 50 states govern the election rules in those states, but within the states, there are separate counties and cities that run elections in different ways. And so each of those cities or counties are the ones who decide where the voting locations are going to be. They recruit the workers who will staff the voting locations and train all of those workers. They will design the ballots. They often select the technology on which people vote, the voting machines themselves. So we're actually going to see a lot of different elections held under kind of loose set of rules that are governed across the states, although there are some general rules that apply to everybody. For instance, although many states have early voting or make mail voting available to a lot of voters, voting will end on November 3rd by law.
So just to affirm to all of our viewers, there will definitely be an election in November. Is that right?
That's right. Despite some speculation to the contrary by some, the laws are very clear with regard to when the election is over in the United States. Those laws are set by Congress. Congress is currently in divided rule with Democrats controlling the House and Republicans controlling the Senate. And that law states that the election will be held, or voting will end on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which this year falls on November 3rd. Furthermore, for the presidency, this is very important. The president's term ends at noon on January 20th, 2021, unless the Electoral College, which meets as a result of the voting that will occur on November 3rd, unless the Electoral College reelects him. If the Electoral College doesn't reelect him, or for some reason the election doesn't happen and the Electoral College can't meet, his term still ends on January 20th at noon. So the Constitution is very clear on that. The election will happen. I'm fairly confident we will have a winner of that election, and there will be an inauguration on January 20th.
And since you mentioned the Electoral College, it is, I think, useful to remind our viewers, the candidate who receives the most votes is not necessarily the candidate who wins our election.
In fact, that's quite right. And in fact, that's happened twice in the last couple of decades, including in 2016. The candidate that wins the most votes nationally is not the winner. The winner is decided by whoever wins what's called the electoral votes in each state. The electoral votes are assigned to states based upon their membership of Congress, larger states getting more electoral votes than smaller states. And the winner of the popular vote in each state is awarded the electoral votes for that state. So you can get a circumstance, as we saw in 2016, where a candidate wins by large margins in some states, like Hillary Clinton did, but did not win enough states, even though a candidate like Donald Trump won by narrow margins in enough states to get a majority of the electoral votes. So it is possible that has happened in 2000 and 2016. It's possible for that to happen again, but it's more often the case that the winner of the popular vote and the winner of the Electoral College is the same person.
All right, so that gives a sketch of what normally happens in a regular election year, but this, of course, is not a normal year. How, when you look at it, how does the coronavirus pandemic generally, how is it going to affect our election?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is an unusual year. It's unprecedented. We've never had anything that looks even close to what we're seeing right now, where we're trying to hold a presidential election in the midst of a pandemic where we all need to maintain social distancing and our lives have changed so much. Before the pandemic hit the United States hard in the early part of 2020, most experts like myself expected that we were going to see turnout of voters in this election that exceeded anything we had seen in our lives. The previous high watermark for turnout since 18-year-olds had the right to vote was in 2008 when President Obama won, when about 61% of eligible voters turned out to vote. We saw about 63% in the early 60s, but you have to go back to about 1908, before World War I, to find an election where as many as 65% of eligible voters voted. And of course, that was a time not so much that so many people turned out, but actually the denominator, the eligible voter number was much less. Many women couldn't vote. Many African Americans still couldn't vote. So that would be unprecedented if we got to around 65% or 2/3 of eligible voters voting. And I actually thought at that time that we would get there. The pandemic hit, and we all wondered what would happen, and whether voters would still turn out, whether they would think that their health and safety was at risk in some way because of the pandemic. But what we're seeing is, in fact, Americans' enthusiasm for participating in elections, Americans' enthusiasm for having a voice in our democracy is stronger than the virus. And that's somewhat inspiring. You see voters standing in line for long periods of time, socially distant by 6 feet, wearing masks, waiting to vote in primaries, even if the presidential nominees had already been selected. Again, it's a remarkable testament to the democratic spirit of the American people. I now expect that we will see an unprecedented number of people turning out to vote in November. That said, how those people vote is going to change. We're going to see more people voting by mail, asking for ballots to be sent to them by mail, which are then returned and validated before they're counted. I think every single state will see a record number of mail ballots this fall. And I think we'll also see a lot of voters choosing to vote early in person. They can vote before Election Day at voting sites, depending upon their state, early. And those votes also get counted. It's a way to make sure that you don't get stuck in a really long line on election day to vote. So I expect we'll see both those things changing significantly. We'll see an election like we have never seen before.
So, David, let me ask you about a couple of things you just mentioned. First, on election day itself, we're going to have many fewer polling stations. Is that right? Because of COVID? And so we expect some pretty long lines.
Well, we could see long lines. It'll depend on how many people have planned and made a plan to vote early in person or by mail. We will see fewer polling locations, and that's for a very good reason. It's because there are fewer locations that are appropriate in this age of social distancing. We shouldn't have polling locations in very small areas where you can't distance socially, for instance, a garage or something like that. We also can't have polling locations where there are large numbers of people who might be more at risk of contracting the virus or getting sick, such as senior centers and places like that. So there are places that we probably used before that we won't be able to use again, and so there will be fewer places. That place where people voted in the past is probably going to be different than where they're voting this year, and people are going to have to be educated about that and know where to look. And so there's going to be a lot of changes for voters this year. They're going to have to plan and learn about the new rules more than they've ever had to do before.
And you mentioned the explosion in mail ballots. Now, there's been some controversy with some political leaders suggesting that there's a fraud problem with mail ballots. In your experience, is that a serious issue?
Well, I'll tell you something. In the United States, mail voting has been very common. We've been voting by mail since at least the Civil War. It's been relied upon by our soldiers through 2 world wars and many other world wars. And there are many states that have been voting primarily by mail for decades, states like Washington and Oregon and Colorado. And there, in fact, in 2016, 1 out of every 4 ballots cast was a mail ballot in the presidential election, the election which President Trump won, of course. So it is something we've seen quite a lot of. We know how to protect mail ballots. We know how to validate mail ballots and make sure that they're cast by the right people. Republican and Democratic election officials all around the country will tell you mail ballots are secure. There's no reason to think that there's any risk of substantial fraud, just like with in-person voting in the United States. Our elections have a high degree of integrity.
And you also mentioned early voting. So just so our viewers can understand, early voting means that weeks before the election starts, there'll be some people already casting their ballots.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, in Virginia, you can vote early 45 days before the election. In Ohio, 28 days before the election. It's just like voting on election day. It's just early. You show up at a polling place. They have your name on the voter list. You confirm your identity and you get a ballot and you cast it. And it goes into a machine, which does not count the ballot yet. It just keeps it in the machine. And only after polls are closed on election night on November 3rd will they touch a button and instruct that machine to then tabulate the ballots and tell everyone who won. But once you voted early, you don't have to go back. You're not allowed to go back. There are protections in place to make sure people don't come back over and over and over again. Everyone can only still vote once, but it's a way to go and vote well in advance. Plan your time when it's not going to be busy, when it's convenient to you, at a location that's convenient to you, and you won't have to stand in line. Most people who vote early are in and out in a very short period of time.
So politicians who want to pull an election eve surprise had better do it a lot earlier than usual.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be people who are voting even in September and throughout the month of October. And, I think the idea of an election eve surprise is one that the media often focuses on. But to be perfectly honest, if you look at polling in the United States, the vast majority of Americans have already decided who they're going to vote for. And so voting early is entirely appropriate for them. If there's nothing that's going to change your mind, go and vote early, get it out of the way, and don't worry about it until after the results are announced.
All right, when we come back after the break, I'm going to talk with David Becker about the potential for foreign interference in our election. After all, remember the Russia probe? In just a moment. Our guest again today is David J. Becker. David Becker is the founder and executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, a nonprofit organization that seeks to ensure that all eligible voters participate in our democratic process as easily and conveniently as possible, with the maximum confidence in the integrity of our electoral system. David built the center after working on election and voting rights with the Pew Charitable Trust, and as a lawyer in the voting section of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. So, David, let's turn to what was a major issue that emerged from the 2016 election, namely the threat, the reality of foreign interference in our election. How serious is this?
Well, it's very serious, and it's been confirmed by the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee and the intelligence community of the United States overall. Russia, there's no question Russia interfered in the election in 2016. They did so intending to help President Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. And they did so through two primary means. One, they scanned and attempted attacks on technological infrastructure around elections in the United States, meaning voter databases, et cetera. They attempted phishing scams on election workers. And they were successful in some small ways. They successfully infiltrated the Illinois database, the Illinois voter database in 2016, although they didn't alter anything. And their goal, it appears, was not so much to change votes. That's very difficult to do, almost impossible. But certainly the attacks on infrastructure led many to doubt the integrity of our system overall. And of course, that's one of their major goals. Their major goal is to get citizens in a democracy to doubt the legitimacy of the democracy, to doubt the outcomes of elections. And I don't think there's any question they were enormously successful in 2016 in that. The other way that they're interfering is, of course, through massive disinformation campaigns, using social media and other means to spread disinformation, political disinformation, racially divisive disinformation, disinformation about the election process, about whether we can trust voting machines or election officials, or about what days even we're supposed to vote. So that's an ongoing problem. What we've just heard recently from the Senate Intelligence Committee and from the intelligence community here in the United States is that these efforts are ongoing. They're expected to ramp up. Russia is still very involved. China is also involved. Iran is also involved. Possibly others, including North Korea, might be involved in this election cycle. So we all have to be on alert for this. It has an effect not just on the systems on which we run elections, but even more importantly on the minds of the American voters. That's their real target, to get citizens in a democracy to doubt their own democracy.
So one assumes, or at least one hopes, that if our adversaries are improving their efforts to undermine our electoral system, are our defenses a lot better today than they were 4 years ago?
Yes, that's the good news. We are about to hold the most secure election we've ever held, which is not to say that we've ever crossed a finish line. We're going to need to continue to improve, and we're never completely impervious to any of these efforts. But we are in much better shape in 2020 than we were in 2016. And one of the key defenses against delegitimizing elections is to have paper ballots that can be audited after the fact, so if there was any infiltration of a voting technology, it would be discovered and fixed. About 75% of all Americans voted on paper ballots in 2016. In 2020, that number will be about 90 to 95% of all Americans will vote on paper ballots, including pretty much every voter in every battleground state, states like Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, which had many non-paper digital ballots in 2016 are now all paper. That's very good. They're moving to audits of those paper, which an audit is a way of checking the ballots against the machine tallies to make sure that the machine counted the ballots correctly. Those are very effective. We're going to see that in many states. The Department of Homeland Security has been very helpful in working with election offices around the country. There's more information sharing about threats between the federal government, the state election offices, and the county election offices than there has ever been. My organization just released a report yesterday. My organization just released a report earlier this month that said that the voter registration databases were more secure than they've ever been. And that's very, very important against the scanning and probing of those databases that we know will occur. So we're in much better shape. That doesn't mean that we're impervious to attack. We expect attacks to continue, and most importantly, the disinformation attacks will definitely continue. And their goal, again, is to get American voters to doubt our system, and particularly to doubt the election of leaders that they might not have preferred. And so both parties, voters across the political spectrum, are targets for this.
And so when you look at American public opinion toward our election system, How worried are you that there is a critical mass of Americans who don't have confidence in the integrity of the system?
I'm quite worried. If you look at polling over the last year, Americans' confidence in our system of elections and election officials overall, our process, is at its lowest point that I've ever seen. I think most pollsters would agree on that. We find ourselves more and more siloed within our media groups that agree with us. We follow people on Twitter who agree with us. We have Facebook friends who agree with us.
David Becker, absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Untitled Washington.
Thanks, Rob.
Everything we do these days seems to be public. Go to a restaurant and people are taking photographs of their meal and posting it on Instagram. Take a walk in the park and someone will flash an iPhone at you and put the image on Facebook. If someone overhears you in the checkout line at a supermarket, they will have no hesitation sharing what you said with their WhatsApp group. This phenomenon is especially powerful among millennials. That's what we call younger people these days, who seem to place a different value on privacy than my generation, what they not always affectionately call the boomers. But voting is something special. It is one of the few things that brings together people of all ages, millennials and boomers alike. And it is one of the few acts whose privacy, integrity, and accuracy we all value. It is something whose security everyone jealously guards, something that, when violated, is both a personal attack and a national assault. We Americans may not have the wonder in our eyes that you could see from those Iraqis, Afghans, and others who only recently enjoyed their first time voting, proudly showing off their inked up thumbs as proof of their commitment to democracy. But that doesn't mean we view voting, whether in a booth or via mail, as anything less than a sacred act, the ultimate personal connection to our civic religion. That's why the multiple assaults on voting these days touch a chord among so many Americans, from the idea that the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and others are trying to manipulate our system, to the idea that there may be some venal politicians in our country brazenly trying to prevent Americans from voting. I am not naive. Countries and politicians will do everything in their power to win. Cheating be damned. But in the world's oldest democracy, a country whose constitutional framework has survived more than 240 years, these attacks are both personal and national. And despite our deep political partisanship, I believe people of goodwill across our political spectrum will just not stand for it, whether the outrages come from enemies abroad or crooked politicians here at home. We Americans are famously impatient, which is why there are fast food restaurants on almost every corner. But we will stand in lines an hour or two or even more to cast our ballots. Though this year, with fears of COVID-19 running high, many of us will wait in long lines at the post office to mail in our votes. The most important things in life are truly worth waiting for. Bahava, Nasalu and Nehayat Havahil Halkam in Barnamage Dachel, Washington. If Kenneth Ladekum Ea Istafsarat, O Ta'alikat, Howell Havahil Halka. Khasatan Howell Ichtamelat Tadachul El Ajnabi, Fi Intakhabatna. Arjuan Tatawasalum Mai, Aber Twitter, ala hashtag Inside Washington. O on Tarasaluni Mubasharatan, ala at Rob Satloff. Sa'arakum el Usbu el Mukbil, wa ila an al Kakum, shukran lakum wa ila leka.